Christine, I just wanted to ask you about this paper you wrote, which was How Cognitive Frames Shape the American Approach to International Relations. What does that mean?
Oh my gosh, you're going to get me to talk about one of my favorite academics. Um, so Richard Nisbett wrote a book on the geography of thought. And for anybody who hasn't read this book, I mean, it was eye-opening for me. And I read it, maybe I want to say like 10, 15 years ago. But that work was looking from a social psychology point of view. They had people in the lab, and Richard Nisbett is a sociologist, social psychologist, sorry, at the University of Michigan, and he does a lot of experimental work in labs. And he had a grad student who was from Asia, right? So from Japan. And they were just exploring differences in how people process information and how they see the world in very, very different ways, and how their cognitive frames are actually quite different, that people have different understandings depending on the culture that they grew up in, right? So I'll just give you kind of like a classic example of the kind of two dimensions, right? And there are lots of people who do this kind of work, but I love the way that he did it and framed a lot of this work and helped our understanding of it. And he designed all of these experiments to expose all of this. So, when they were looking at the differences between, say, Japanese students and American students, right? Like two kind of very different kinds of super individualistic societies and a super collectivist one, right? At the two ends of the extreme, right? So I would say France is more on the individualistic side. I would say Nigeria, is probably a bit more on the collectivist side with kind of spikes of individualism. But, thinking about the contrast in how these societies operated, also, you could see that the way that they analyzed the world, the people from these two populations, two student populations, really processed information differently. So I'll give you one of the experiments so you can sort of understand what was going on. So they had, for example, and I do this experiment with my students just to help them understand, right, what's going on here, that they would show students a clip of an aquarium, and it had, fish in it, and then seaweed and, bubbles and all sorts of stuff, right? And they would show it to them with the fish moving around for maybe like 20 seconds. I can't remember exactly how long it was, not very long. And then they would say, draw the aquarium, right? Draw what you saw to the best of your ability. And when they analyzed what the American students drew versus what the Asian students drew, the American students got all the fish, right? Got all the big fish. And but they kind of missed out on the background details, right? Like they would miss the rocks. They would miss the seaweed. They would miss kind of the coral. They would miss the things that weren't the fish, okay? And then on the Asian side, like the Asians were much better too but they got the size of the fish right, right? So that was interesting. But the Asian students were much better at capturing all of the background and in relation to where the fish were, right? So the fish and in relation to the background and the rocks and the, whatever's along the bottom and all of this. So they got the environment much more right, right? So this was just to say, I mean, they had so many of these different kinds of experiments, but, just that one experiment shows you the way in which you process information, in part was because in Japan and in Japanese society, your relationship to your environment is so important. That people really think about the collective, and they think about, not just the individual and the importance of the individual, right? And in an American society, a much more individualistic society, it really is the people who count, and the relation in, the kind of size of the fish, right? Like as a stand-in for power or hierarchy or whatever, right? So, but it was those other things in the background just didn't come up as much, right? And they had so many of these kinds of really, really fascinating experiments, and you read them in their totality. And I could go on, like I have so many of these that I could name for you. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so interesting, and it totally explains me, right? Because I was brought up, my parents are from Hong Kong, so I am in many ways like, I think like an Asian, but I also think, because I was brought up in Canada, like a total individualistic Canadian, right?
Mm.
So, but I could see my brain oftentimes like flipping between different modes of thought. And when I read that book, I thought, oh, that totally makes sense for explaining me and my identity
Mm.
and who I am. But also it helped me think about international relations. It helped me think about conflict. It helped me think about why I think about the world the way that I do, in part because, I often switch between these kinds of different frames all the time, that I do this very intuitively. But he actually showed the science behind like what is going on there. And also that you're malleable, right? So I spent time as an exchange student in Japan too. And I could see a lot of the things that were described in these experiments, and why then Japanese society was so foreign to me and why it was so weird. And I understood then also like a lot of the practices and just things that had happened earlier. I was like, oh, this makes so much sense now that I
Mm.
understand. Oh, actually, it's a whole way of like organizing your brain, but the way in which you frame things is also reinforced by the environment around you. And so when you change your environment, then your frames change, right? That made so much sense to
Wow.
me,
Wow.
right? So, I mean, absolutely, I would say mind blowing in terms of like
Mm.
like power of the revelation there.
Oh, wow. So I guess for us, we have this dichotomy of the individualist mindset and the collectivist mindset. But someone who is very English, um, if they were put in a more collectivist environment, would they also be more collectivist? Like if they were in China or Nigeria, would they also start to change
So are you bringing some over as a kid, or are you bringing them over as like
as an adult?
as an adult, and at what age, and like to what extent,
Okay.
to what extent is
Too
that
many
person
factors.
kind of like
Okay.
malleable to the environment? I mean, these are generalizations, right? You're always going to have people who are very individualistic within a collectivist society and very collectivist within an individualistic society, right? So we're just talking about like broad, broad norms,
Mm.
broad averages here. But the fact that you can see these effects is very interesting, right? And things like religion will shape all of that, gender norms will shape all of that. There are lots of things that go into the making of this. But you can see it in all sorts of things, both
Mm.
like in the way in which people analyze problems, the ways that people explain things, the extent to which people would, if there's a particular situation and everything goes wrong, right? Do you blame it on the individual or do you blame it on the environment, right? And I would
Mm.
say largely in individualistic societies, you blame it on the individual and you
Mm.
really underestimate the power of all of the environmental factors. Whereas if you're, and they've shown this actually again with another one of these
Mm.
experiments, right? They were looking to ask somebody, they asked people, hey, like there was a mass shooting that happened in a university lab. And one of the experiments was to ask people from the kind of, Asian side and the American side, what would you say, led up to the person doing this?
Mm.
And the people on the, American side would list like maybe 10 factors or something, or 5 factors, whatever it was, some small number of things. And the people on the other side, on the Asian side, would list like 100 things.
So
Right?
fascinating.
Like,
Mm.
and they had read the same kind of like, you know, um, the prep work for understanding the case and how it was described. They had the same material, and they, this was a case that was in the news. Um, but they thought about it really quite differently and
Mm.
processed the event quite differently. I hope I'm not mangling any of these experiments, but I mean, there are so many of them that are like this. And I just generally love social psychology and using it to explain like why my brain works the way that
Mm.
it does, but also why somebody else's brain works very differently. And then if you understand that too, I think, again, this is another piece of the empathy, right? It is that you have really different values than I do because you sit within the social construction of, your society and your place within that society. And there are things that you are allowed to do, and there are things that you see that are important or not important. And I might see exactly the opposite,